Most people believe suffering is something they are trying to escape. They believe pain is an enemy. They believe discomfort is a curse. They believe sadness, stress, anxiety, and frustration are problems to solve. But the truth is darker than that. Most people are not running away from suffering. They are addicted to it. Not because suffering feels good, but because suffering feels familiar. And the human mind will always choose familiar pain over unfamiliar freedom. Look around you. People complain about their lives every single day, about their jobs, their relationships, their families, their bodies, their circumstances. And yet, they wake up and choose the same routines, the same habits, the same people, the same mistakes. Not because they are forced, but because pain has become their identity. Because suffering is no longer something that happens to them. It is something they are. There is a strange comfort in misery, a strange safety in struggle. Because when you suffer, you no longer have to take responsibility for becoming better. Pain gives you a story. Pain gives you an excuse. Pain gives you a reason to stay small without feeling guilty. And that is why people cling to it. Look at the person who keeps entering toxic relationships. They cry. They promise change. They swear they've learned their lesson. And yet, they are drawn to the same type of person again and again. Not because they are unlucky, but because chaos feels like home. Because peace feels unfamiliar. Because when love is calm, quiet, and stable, it feels boring. And boredom terrifies a mind addicted to emotional chaos. So they choose drama. They choose pain. They choose betrayal. They choose suffering. Because suffering makes them feel alive. There are people who don't know who they are without pain. When life becomes quiet, when things start going right, when stability appears, they feel uncomfortable, not relieved, not grateful, uncomfortable, because without pain, they don't know how to define themselves anymore. They don't know what to complain about. They don't know what story to tell. They don't know what role to play. Suffering becomes their personality, and without it, they feel empty. This is why some people unconsciously destroy good things, good relationships, good opportunities, good moments. Not because they want to fail, but because success feels foreign, because happiness feels unfamiliar, and the mind rejects what it does not recognize, so it sabotages, not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, with small decisions, with excuses, with procrastination, with emotional reactions, with impulsive behavior, until everything collapses again. And then they say, "See, this is just how my life is." No, this is how your mind is. From childhood, many people were trained to associate love with pain. They were loved when they were sick. They were noticed when they were struggling. They were cared for when they were weak. So their mind learned something dangerous. Pain equals attention. Pain equals connection. Pain equals significance. And when they grow up, they unconsciously recreate suffering, because suffering makes them feel seen. There are people who don't know how to receive love unless it hurts. They don't trust calm affection. They don't believe in peaceful bonds. They only feel real when something is wrong. So they provoke conflict. They overthink. They assume betrayal. They imagine rejection. Because without suffering, they feel invisible. This is why some people would rather stay in misery than step into uncertainty. They would rather be miserable in a place they know than free in a place they don't understand. Because misery is predictable. Freedom is not. Misery is controllable. Freedom demands responsibility. And responsibility terrifies a mind addicted to pain. Because once you are free, You can no longer blame anyone. You can no longer hide behind circumstances. You can no longer play the victim. You can no longer tell the story of, "I would have, if." Freedom removes excuses. And excuses are the favorite drug of the suffering mind. Look at how people talk. "I can't change because of my past. I'm like this because of my parents. This is just who I am. I tried. It didn't work." These are not explanations. These are emotional hiding places. Suffering allows people to avoid the terrifying question, "Who would I become if I stopped being broken?" Because becoming whole is far more frightening than staying damaged. When you are broken, nobody expects much from you. But when you are capable, expectation appears, pressure appears, responsibility appears. And most people don't fear failure. They fear being powerful and having no excuse left. This is why some people remain in environments that drain them. Not because they cannot leave, but because leaving would mean accepting that they chose to stay. And that realization is unbearable. So they prefer to say, "I have no choice." Because no choice is comforting. It removes guilt. It removes accountability. It removes the burden of self-respect. There is also a darker layer. Some people suffer because suffering gives them moral superiority. They suffer louder than others. They speak about their pain publicly. They showcase their struggles. They build an identity around being misunderstood, oppressed, unlucky, or mistreated. And slowly, their suffering becomes their currency. Attention flows toward pain. Sympathy flows toward pain. And once you are rewarded for pain, you become addicted to it. You begin to unconsciously exaggerate it, preserve it, protect it. Because without it, you would feel ordinary. And many people would rather be tragically special than peacefully average. Suffering gives meaning when meaning is absent. It gives direction when purpose is missing. It gives a narrative when life feels empty. And that is why people cling to it. Because without suffering, they would have to confront the silence. And silence reveals everything they've been avoiding. There is another uncomfortable truth. Some people don't want healing. They want validation. They don't want solutions. They want confirmation that their pain is justified. Because solutions end the story. But validation extends it. Healing ends the identity they've built. And most people would rather suffer with a familiar identity than heal into an unknown version of themselves. This is why advice often irritates people, because advice threatens their addiction to pain. It suggests that change is possible. And if change is possible, then staying the same becomes a choice. And that is the one thing a suffering mind refuses to accept. Look closely at how people react when you offer solutions. They resist, they argue, they minimize, they explain why it won't work. Not because the solution is wrong, but because the solution would take away their suffering. And with it, their excuses, their identity, their story. There is comfort in saying, "This is just how life is," because it removes the responsibility of shaping life. And responsibility is heavy. Responsibility requires discipline, self-awareness, uncomfortable honesty, and suffering allows people to avoid all of that. There is also fear hiding beneath the addiction, fear of being alone with yourself, because when suffering ends, distractions fade, drama disappears, noise quiets down, and you are left with your thoughts, your emptiness, your unfulfilled potential, your ignored dreams, your avoided fears, and many people prefer chaos over clarity, because chaos distracts. Clarity demands action. Suffering also gives people a strange sense of control. When you expect pain, You are never disappointed. You prepare for loss, for failure, for rejection. So when it happens, you say, "I knew it." And that gives your ego a twisted satisfaction. You were right, even if right means miserable. Optimism risks disappointment, but pessimism guarantees familiarity. And familiarity feels safe, even when it destroys you. Look at how many people live their lives waiting for things to go wrong, waiting for betrayal, waiting for collapse, waiting for disappointment. Because if things go right, they feel exposed. Because now they must protect happiness. And protecting happiness requires vulnerability. And vulnerability is terrifying to a mind trained by suffering. There are people who panic when life becomes stable, when bills are paid, when relationships are calm, when days are peaceful. They feel something is wrong. Not because something is wrong, but because their nervous system is addicted to chaos. They don't know how to exist without emotional turbulence, so they create problems. They pick fights. They overthink. They assume threats that are not there. Because suffering is familiar. Peace is foreign. And the brain resists foreign territory. The darkest part? Some people would rather destroy themselves slowly than change themselves quickly. Because slow destruction feels easier than rapid transformation. Transformation requires letting go of who you've been. And letting go of identity feels like death to the ego. So instead, they decay comfortably. They complain. They delay. They distract. They numb themselves, while telling themselves they are surviving. But survival is not living. Survival is just dying slowly without calling it that. There is a moment in every person's life when suffering stops being imposed and starts being chosen. Not consciously, but emotionally. And from that moment on, pain is no longer an accident. It becomes a pattern, a loop, a prison disguised as familiarity. And the key to that prison is not outside. It is inside the mind. The addiction to suffering is not about enjoying pain. It is about avoiding responsibility, avoiding uncertainty, avoiding growth, avoiding the terrifying realization that you could become more if you stopped clinging to who you are now. The mind prefers a predictable hell. Heaven requires you to become someone new, and hell allows you to remain who you are. This is why change feels violent to the psyche, because it threatens identity, and identity, even when painful, feels safer than freedom. Most people don't lack opportunity. They lack the willingness to abandon their suffering. They don't lack chances. They lack the courage to live without excuses. They don't lack strength. They lack the desire to stop being comfortable in pain. And until that changes, no motivation will save them. No advice will help them. No inspiration will move them. Because the mind will always protect what it is attached to, even when what it is attached to is destroying it. Freedom does not come from escaping pain. It comes from letting go of the identity built around pain, and that is the hardest thing a human being can ever do. Because once you are no longer broken, you are responsible for becoming powerful. And power leaves no one to blame.